So good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to 11th clinic of our Advanced Gastro Summit 2020. And it is a matter of pride that we have completed our half century today. Actually, there are 22 sessions which are going to be conducted, 22 sessions which are going to be conducted, and today is our 11th topic today. So today we have a very honorable and respected speaker from Bombay who is expert in motility disorders. And before starting, I would like to thank Gujarat State Chapter of ASI, Gujarat State Surgeons Association, Association of Physicians of Gujarat and Ahmedabad, Association of Surgeons Association of Ahmedabad, and Gujarat State Family Physician Association who has contributed for this academic program. I would like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Ekant Gupta, who is an young and enthusiastic gastroenterologist at Palanpur. He has started his practice around 2-3 months back, and we wish him all the best of luck. So, Dr. Ekant, I would request you to introduce our today's chairperson, and Dr. Dhiren will be introducing Dr. Rajesh. And I would request Dr. Narendra Sanghvi at the end to give a vote of thanks. And you can also ask questions, sir, and interrupt in between as per your convenience. Ekant, please introduce Dr. Dhiren and Dr. Narendra Sanghvi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yogesh Harmani. Very good evening, all seniors, friends, and colleagues. So, as a part of Advanced Gastroenterology Summit 2020, we are here for the 11th lecture. And today we are honored to have two chairpersons. First is Dr. Narendra Sanghvi, sir. He is senior surgeon and gastroenterologist at Anand Surgical Hospital, Ahmedabad. And Dr. Dhirendra Sanadia. He is the president of Ahmedabad Family Physician Association. So, I would like to hand over the session to Dr. Dhirendra Sanadia, sir. And he will introduce our renowned speaker and will start the program now.
Thank you, Dr. Ekant Gupta, for inviting me as a chairperson in Advanced Gastroenterology Summit 2020. Today's topic is very interesting, non-obstructive dysphagia. And with us today, eminent speaker from Mumbai, Dr. Rajesh Sainani. He is a consultant gastroenterologist in Mumbai. He is attached to Jaslok Hospital and Sir H.N. Reliance Foundation Hospital. He holds an MD in internal medicine and DNB in gastroenterology. Also, he is a fellow of Royal Melbourne Hospital, Australia. He attended many workshops and courses of gastroenterology. His area of special interests are motility disorder of GI tract, GERD, and constipation. Dr. Sainani has participated in many research studies and clinical trials. He has a large number of publications and has presented different papers in conferences all over the country. He is a respected member of various national and international bodies and association conducted to gastroenterology. Now I request Dr. Rajesh Sainani to start his talk on non-obstructive dysphagia. Dr. Rajesh Sainani, sir, please.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dhirendra. Thank you, Dr. Narendra. Thank you, Ekant and Yogesh. Thank you for inviting me for this. And good evening, friends. You all have come back from your clinic. I hope you have got some dinner to eat. And I think that is the big advantage of Zoom, that we can eat food at the same time and listen to the lecture. I will now start sharing my screen. We can start the talk. So, screen sharing has been paused. That is what it is saying. Is there a technical problem from your side?
Mr. Santosh?
Yes, sir. Give us 1 minute, sir, to get it corrected.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
All right. So can you see my opening slide?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And everyone can hear me clearly? Okay. So I'm going to be talking today on non-obstructive dysphagia, approach and management. So what is dysphagia? Dysphagia is derived from the Greek word difficulty to eat. As simple as that. It is a subjective sensation, but most importantly, dysphagia is an alarm symptom. What do we mean by alarm symptom? It is something that should not be ignored. It is something which should not be left uninvestigated. It is something which should not just receive empiric therapy. If a patient has dysphagia, you need to investigate and find the cause. Many elderly patients will say that they have developed dysphagia, and it should not be considered due to normal aging. Aging causes mild esophageal dysmotility, but rarely patients are symptomatic. So whether it is a young child, young boy, young adult, or an elderly person, if they have dysphagia, dysphagia is an alarm symptom and you must investigate it. There are two types, acute and non-acute. Acute means sudden onset while they were eating food. You need immediate evaluation. They are literally choking on it. They are very uncomfortable and restless, and they need immediate evaluation and therapy. What we'll be discussing today will be more the non-acute dysphagia, which is two types, oropharyngeal, as the name suggests, or esophageal. So how do we take a history and how does the history guide us in a patient with dysphagia? The questions that we usually ask: do you have problem in initiating a swallow? Or do you feel that the food gets stuck after a few seconds? If you have a problem to initiate the swallow, then you have oropharyngeal dysphagia, while if the food gets stuck after a few seconds, then it is esophageal dysphagia. Do you cough or choke on the food? And does the food come out from your nose? Then this suggests oropharyngeal dysphagia. Is there a problem with swallowing solids, liquids, or both? Because usually liquids and not solids suggest a motility disorder, while solids first, which later on progresses to liquids, is sinister and more likely to be a malignant stricture. How long have you had these problems? Is it stable? Is it intermittent? Has it progressed? If it's rapidly progressive, then higher chance that you may be looking at something more serious like a cancer. Where do you feel that the food is stuck? Can the patient localize it? Localization is great for oropharyngeal when patients point to the neck, but it is very poor when the patients point retrosternally, because a person with lower third esophagus cancer can also have a mid-sternal obstruction. So there's only a 50% correlation for esophageal dysphagia. You must ask the patient if they have any other symptoms such as loss of appetite, weight loss, nausea, vomiting, regurgitation of food, heartburn, vomiting, or any blood when they cough out or vomit out the food. Or is there odynophagia or chest pain? So these are all the other symptoms which help us to guide as to what may be the probable differential diagnosis. You must always ask a detailed history of pre-existing diseases such as diabetes mellitus, scleroderma, AIDS, or neurological conditions such as stroke, Parkinson's, myasthenia gravis, or even cancer, especially if they've had surgery or radiation for laryngeal or esophageal cancer. That's some important history you want to know in a patient of dysphagia. Which medications they are taking. Patients don't tell every doctor all the medicines they are taking because they see a surgeon separately, they see an orthopedic person separately, they see a family physician separately, and they don't tell each other what medications they are taking, because we know certain potassium preparations, alendronate, which is used for osteoporosis, are iron tablets, quinidine, ascorbic acid, so commonly being used, tetracycline or doxycycline, aspirin, NSAIDs. All these can cause dysphagia if not taken with adequate water, or if the patient lies down immediately after swallowing a tablet. So history is very important. For oropharyngeal dysphagia, if you suspect that they say there's a difficulty in initiating swallow, you ask them what maneuvers they do. Do they need water to push the food up? Do they mix the rice with the dal to make it soft and then try to swallow it? Do they drink a glass of water every time they eat their food? Do they have associated dry mouth, dry eyes, because you're looking at the immune disorders, the Zika syndromes? Is there dysarthria, a weak cough, hoarseness of the voice? Is there laryngeal nerve involvement? Is there a neurological cause for their dysphagia? Do they get bland food regurgitation? Can that be something like achalasia? Is there a bad breath, which can be seen in a Zenker's diverticulum? Does the dysphagia not happen initially? So some people will be able to eat their food, but at the end of the meal, they start feeling dysphagia. Then it is a fatigable illness. Then you say, does he have myasthenia gravis? Is there any referred pain which may suggest a cancer? Asking history helps localize what is the reason for the dysphagia. Common causes for oropharyngeal dysphagia: neurologically, we commonly see strokes, Parkinson's, and dementia patients. Myopathic causes like myasthenia gravis or polymyositis. If they have had history of radiation, that's definitely can cause radiation involvement of the throat. It can dry up their secretions. It can cause strictures. Infections, commonness. Diabetic patients come with candida infection. Patients on steroids come with candida infections. And if there are structural lesions like a Zenker's diverticulum, osteophytes, commonly cervical osteophytes causing dysphagia, or a cricopharyngeal bar, that is a non-relaxing cricopharyngeal muscle. For esophageal dysphagia, you have mechanical lesions and motility disorders. In mechanical lesions, there are intrinsic causes such as a stricture, tumor, Katsky's ring, or a web, or extrinsic compression to the esophagus that can occur in an aberrant subclavian artery, an enlarged aorta, or a left atrium, or even a mediastinal mass. If you're suspecting a motility disorder where you have dysphagia to both liquids and solids, you have to think, do they have achalasia, a distal spasm where there is chest pain predominant, ineffective motility, or a spastic esophagus such as jackhammer, or in scleroderma, where also they have ineffective motility. Functional disorders, where no cause can be found, but patient still complains of dysphagia, then you say they have functional dysphagia. So when we approach a patient for dysphagia, like I said, you ask, is there a difficulty in initiating a swallow? Then you have oropharyngeal dysphagia, which is usually associated with regurgitation, coughing, or choking. If the sensation of food getting stuck takes a few seconds after a swallow, then it is probably esophageal dysphagia. After a good history, a physical examination, we do tests to rule out metabolic causes. And then if you're suspecting oropharyngeal dysphagia, it's usually CNS imaging. If the cause is specific, like a stroke or a trauma, usually a video fluoroscopy, and if required, a esophageal manometry can subclassify whether the CNS dysfunction is severe, that causes a risk of aspiration, and then do they need additional things to prevent aspiration, like a nasogastric tube or a PEG? Or is the CNS dysfunctional dependent on a specific cause, like myasthenia gravis or myopathy or tumors? Then you treat that specific cause. If they have no systemic disease, then you say, is there a local nasal cause that is causing a structural abnormality? Is there a Zenker's diverticulum? So these patients may also require nasal endoscopy, video fluoroscopy, endoscopy, and maybe manometry. So in a patient who has a CNS cause, we do and has dysphagia, we can do video manometry, or that's basically barium swallows plus the measure of the pressures of the upper esophageal sphincter. You can see in the first X-ray that the patient has swallowed, and in the center one, you can see that there's a lot of residue of barium in the pharynx and the pyriform fossa. If you see the right column of the manometry, that is the pressure study of the upper esophageal sphincter, you can see that the first swallow, there is some relaxation, but then there is no relaxation. So they will have incoordination and intermittent non-relaxing upper esophageal sphincter, which may be responsible for the residual barium in the pharynx and the pyriform fossa. And this is what will cause them to cough or choke on the food bolus. Zenker's diverticulum, this is an outpouching of the pharynx which occurs just below the inferior constrictor muscle and the cricopharyngeal sphincter. It's a pseudo-diverticulum because it contains only the mucosa and submucosa. And you can see on the right in the barium swallow, this outpouching that you can see, that is of the Zenker's diverticulum. Cricopharyngeal bar, this commonly occurs in patients of Zenker's diverticulum, but may also be present in patients who don't have it. You can see on the barium image that there is a indrawing, like a pouch going in. This is the contraction of the cricopharyngeal muscle into the esophagus, which is causing obstruction. And if you see in the right upper corner, you can see that the upper esophageal sphincter does not relax adequately when the patient swallows. And this causes dysphagia. So when we approach a patient with esophageal dysphagia, if the symptoms are with both solids and liquids, and it is progressive and associated with chronic heartburn, then you say, does this patient have GERD or does she have scleroderma? If it is associated with regurgitation, so dysphagia to solids and liquids, progressive, associated with regurgitation, does he have achalasia? If he has dysphagia to solids and liquids, which is intermittent and associated with chest pain, then you think on the right side here, does he have a distal esophageal spasm? But if the symptoms are with solids only, then you have to think, is it structural? If it is progressive, you need to think, is it slowly progressive? Then it's probably a stricture. If it's rapidly progressive, it is a cancer. And if it's intermittent, then you have to think, is there an esophageal ring? Is there a web? Or is there esophagitis? Patients of reflux disease, as you all know, present with chronic heartburn, regurgitation. And there's a study which showed that almost 48% patients of reflux disease may have some symptoms of dysphagia. We know that reflux disease patients may have either non-erosive reflux or an erosive reflux, like this, where there may be erosions within the esophagus. But when we do their manometry, why do they get dysphagia? See the left upper hand, that is a normal esophageal manometry. Manometry is a pressure reading from the esophagus, right from the upper esophagus to the lower esophagus. This wave-like contraction from the top suggests that this is a normal esophageal contraction. And you can see here that the lower esophageal sphincter is relaxing. In a patient with reflux disease, because of long-standing reflux, they have poor motility. The right side picture, you can see that there is ineffective or poor peristalsis. The lower esophageal sphincter pressures are also low. So a lax lower esophageal sphincter is responsible for reflux disease, which may or may not be associated with a hiatus hernia. On the left lower corner, what you're seeing is what we call as a 24-hour pH study, the blue line is the measurement of acid or acid reflux in the esophagus. The black line in the center is at 4. So all the dips below 4 are the reflux episodes. And all these arrows on the top are the symptoms. So this patient of gastroesophageal reflux disease has poor gastric motility, has low LES pressures, has significant reflux on a 24-hour pH study. This patient can be offered something more than just therapy. So in patients with dysphagia, if they have reflux disease, we know that proton pump therapy is the mainstay of treatment. Choose the proton pump of your choice. Usually patients with dysphagia need a twice daily therapy, and they need it for a long duration. Don't give proton pump inhibitors for 10 days, 12 days, 15 days. How we don't give antibiotics for 2 days. You give minimum for 5 or 7 days. The same way, proton pump inhibitors therapy is minimum 6 to 8 weeks. We should not, if you want to see the patient earlier, you want to assess response, please write PPI, omeprazole or pantoprazole, whatever your choice, twice daily, and tell them to review earlier, but write the duration as 2 months. And that is what helps these patients of reflux who have dysphagia because of this motility. Yes, some of them may need diet modifications, but usually it's not to do with the consistency, but it is to do with the timing of the food. So because you have a weak lower esophageal sphincter, you tell them not to have their dinner very late. There's at least should be a 4-hour gap. So you tell them to try to eat their dinner by 7 p.m. so that they don't get reflux when they sleep, and that protects the esophageal muscle. What's the role of prokinetics? Very common. I know we all are prescribing DSRs and D and L of all, but there is no role in reflux disease for prokinetics. Role of prokinetics is or can be given only if you have associated dyspepsia with reflux disease. And of course, since the prokinetics don't work on the esophageal muscle, they have no role in dysphagia associated with reflux disease. So possibly reflux associated dysphagia is the commonest cause that we see in our clinical practice. In achalasia, patients will present with dysphagia with solids and liquids. It is progressive. There is usually bland regurgitation. There may be associated chest pain, heartburn. The barium, if picked up early, can be normal. I see regularly patients, and that's how achalasias are missed earlier. It can be normal. It's a dilated esophagus only if there is a long-standing esophagus. And a lot of bariums are actually done by the technician and not by the radiologist. And he has no concept of motility disorders, and he doesn't realize that what time plays in a barium swallow. Endoscopy, again, if done early in dysphagia, can be normal in achalasia, but if the patients have long-standing symptoms, they will come with a dilated esophagus, with mucus or liquid or food residue. And usually the endoscopist will say that he felt a resistance when he was trying to go across from the esophagus into the stomach at the esophagogastric junction. So what you see here on the left side is a barium of a sigmoid esophagus, an endoscopic picture of a grossly dilated esophagus. Definitely this is a long-standing history of many years and not weeks or months, which has been missed. On the right side is the esophageal manometry. I showed you a normal manometry, while this is achalasia, where you can see this is the upper esophageal sphincter. This is the lower esophageal sphincter. The lower esophageal sphincter is not relaxing, and there is no wave-like contraction coming down in the esophageal body. Okay, there is just a vertical line. All right, so this is achalasia type 1. In achalasia type 2, you can see that the lower esophageal sphincter is not relaxing, but you can see these pink pan-esophageal pressurizations. So this is because of some residual function of the longitudinal muscle of the esophagus, which causes esophageal shortening and pan-esophageal pressurization. So this is type 2 achalasia. Why am I telling you types of achalasia? I will come to later. And type 3 is called a spastic esophagus, where there will be some residual peristalsis, but usually the lower 2/3 is spastic. And you can see that even here, the lower esophageal sphincter is not relaxing. What is the treatment in achalasia? Drugs, very poorly effective. Okay, less than 5% response. Botox, short-term response. So usually given to patients who are very high risk for surgery or for definitive endoscopic therapy. So the main line of treatment is 1, pneumatic dilatation, 2, laparoscopic myotomy, and the new kid on the block, POEM, that is per oral endoscopic myotomy. So how do we decide which is the best therapy? Does it depend on whether you are a surgeon or a gastroenterologist? So if you're a surgery, you're going to operate. And if you're a gastroenterologist, you're going to dilate or do a POEM? No. Does it depend upon the age of the patient? Maybe. Dilatation of the esophagus? Or is it the patient's decision? But the evidence says that the decision should be taken based on the type of achalasia on the manometry. So if you have a type 1 achalasia, the first example I showed you, then surgery does better than pneumatic dilatation. If there is a type 2 achalasia, then whether you do a surgery or a myotomy, both are equal. And for type 3, when this study was done in 2008, POEM was really not very popular. So we didn't have any option. But now the type 3s definitely go for POEM as the treatment option for achalasia. Also now there are many comparative trials between POEM and myotomy showing that they both are equally effective, except that the POEM has a higher risk of reflux disease as compared to the myotomy. So wherever myotomy is being recommended in the types of achalasia, a lot of centers are now even offering POEM as a choice because it is found to be equally efficacious. So if you have suspect esophagogastric obstruction, patients may have dysphagia, chest pain, and regurgitation. We want to rule out a malignancy or an infiltrative region. We know that the topic today is non-obstructive dysphagia. So the endoscopy will be normal. But sometimes you can miss an infiltrative lesion from outside the esophagus or a node pressing on the esophagus. So you may need a CT scan or an endosonography if you get a EGJ or an esophagogastric junction obstruction. In a EGJ obstruction, there is peristalsis present, but along the flow of the peristalsis, there is a high intrabolus pressure, and that's what causes the obstruction. There are some hypotheses that if you follow up an EGJ obstruction over months or years, this may turn into an achalasia. But it's not that every EGJ turns into achalasia. So if there is no benign or malignant lesion found on imaging, then we treat the EGJ obstruction like achalasia, where the goal is to reduce LES pressures, because in EGJ obstruction, they do have preserved esophageal motility. So again, the options are same: botulinum toxin, pneumatic dilatation, laparoscopic myotomy, or even POEM. If you are chest pain predominant with your dysphagia and sometimes heart vein or regurgitation, and the barium shows a corkscrew esophagus, and you have a normal endoscopy, you think of distal esophageal spasm. On the left side, you can see what a corkscrew esophagus looks like. In distal esophageal spasm, it's predominantly diagnosed on esophageal manometry, where the middle and the lower third of the esophagus contracts simultaneously. So that is why patients have dysphagia. You measure what is called distal latency, that is a manometric term. which says that a significant part of the esophagus is contracting fast, and that's why the patient is developing dysphagia. There is also esophageal spasm, which is associated with a hypercontractile lower esophageal sphincter. So you can see in the body of the esophagus, it is straight. That is, the middle and the lower esophagus is contracting simultaneously, but the spasticity is present in the lower esophageal sphincter, which may be contributing to the chest pain also. Jackhammer esophagus, which is another spastic type of esophagus, is where the entire body of the esophagus is of very high amplitude. We measure something called as GCI. If it is more than 8,000, in this you can see here on the right lower corner, it is 19,000. That is the amplitude of the contraction, the distal contractile integral. If that is so, this is the classic variant of a jackhammer esophagus. These are, some of you may have heard it, some of you may not have heard it. It's new terminology which you should be aware of in patients with dysphagia and chest pain. So you can also get a jackhammer esophagus, which is a mix of both. That is, it has a high contraction of more than 8,000, but it has a short distal latency. That means, like the distal esophageal spasm, the middle and the lower third of the esophagus contract simultaneously along with a spastic esophagus. Does it matter to the patient? Probably not, because the treatment is quite similar for both the distal esophageal spasm and the jackhammer esophagus. Treat the symptoms. If patient is getting chest pain and dysphagia once in 3 months, and you found something fancy on the manometry, that doesn't mean you have to make him undergo a surgery. You have to see how much symptoms the patient has and how frequent they are, and do they affect his quality of life. Commonly, this is associated with reflux disease. So the first line of treatment is to give proton pump inhibitors twice a day for at least 3 months. If the chest pain frequency is high, you can give simple peppermint oil, that is, commonly called as pudinhara, which helps to relax the esophageal spasm. If the frequency of chest pain is frequent and they don't have any ECG abnormalities, we give diltiazem. Sildenafil, that is Viagra, has also been used, but of course, it has its side effects of headache and priapism, so it may not be suitable to everyone. Nitroglycerin and isosorbide dinitrate have been tried, but again, headache is a very important side effect that patients suffer. So I usually find good result with peppermint oil or long-term diltiazem. Remember that these patients also have an associated hypersensitivity, which may be because of their nerves which supply the esophagus, and usually amitriptyline helps to reduce this chest pain or visceral hypersensitivity. Botulinum toxin again has been tried to relax the spastic lower third of the esophagus. If the patient is significantly symptomatic, you can offer POEM or an esophagomyotomy, because this cuts, with the POEM, you can do a long myotomy, and this helps to relax the spastic segment of the esophagus. If the patient has suspected scleroderma, they will have dysphagia, they may have associated regurgitation, but you have to look at the patient. They will usually have restricted mouth opening. They will have dryness of their secretions. And yes, they will have their heartburn and regurgitation. You can see the dilatation of the esophagus in a scleroderma barium, but the beaking is sometimes, it's not like the achalasia. Why? Because in achalasia, the lower esophageal sphincter also does not relax, while in scleroderma, the lower esophageal sphincter pressures are extremely low. Please note that scleroderma affects smooth muscle and not skeletal muscle, while achalasia affects the entire length of the esophagus. So in scleroderma, as you can see on the right side, when we do an esophageal manometry, there is some contraction in the upper third of the esophagus, but absent peristalsis in the lower two-third and very low LES or lower esophageal sphincter pressures. In scleroderma, 90% will have abnormal esophageal motility. More than 40% will have esophageal reflux, which will be symptomatic. And stricture developing is so high that it has now been recommended by the American Rheumatology Association that if you diagnose a patient of scleroderma, you have to assume that they will develop esophageal reflux, esophageal stricture and complications. So as a prevention, you have to put them on long-term proton pump therapy. We must also look for myopathy because scleroderma patients may develop that. If the CPK is high, they develop esophageal myopathy, and sometimes they may need prednisolone or immunomodulators to improve the myopathy. Vascular decompressions causing dysphagia, they can be congenital or acquired, like a double aortic arch, a right aortic arch with a retroesophageal left subclavian artery, a left ligamentum arteriosum, and a whole lot of them. But commonly what we see is a large aneurysm of the thoracic aorta in our elderly, and very rarely an aberrant right subclavian artery. So the diagnosis is of course by CT and EUS and even esophageal manometry, because the patient may present with dysphagia, and dysphagia because of a vessel compressing the esophagus is called arteria lusoria. So as you can see at the upper end of the esophagus, there is this horizontal high pressure reading, which is causing dysphagia. And this is the high pressure reading due to an aberrant right subclavian artery. All right. And what is the treatment? Of course, congenital disorders are detected and treated earlier. And of course, congenital means that children don't usually complain of dysphagia. So only the adult onset ones are the ones we see. And most patients with an aberrant right subclavian remain asymptomatic through their life. They may present in their older age. We usually just offer them modification of their diet, use water, try to eat softer foods. Rarely have we ever sent anybody for surgery for an aberrant right subclavian artery. Myasthenia gravis, patient comes to us with dysphagia. You have to ask history. You have to look at the patient's face. Again, like in scleroderma, how you see a narrow mouth, a poor mouth opening here, you may pick up the ptosis, you may pick up the expressionless face, but their main complaint is dysphagia, and that the dysphagia comes on more towards the end of the meal. Yeah. So the findings on manometry for myasthenia gravis are not seen in all cases of myasthenia gravis. So I'm not telling you that if you diagnose a case of myasthenia gravis, do a manometry. But occasionally these patients of dysphagia have first reached a gastroenterologist before reaching a neurologist. And we have done first an endoscopy, which is normal, and we've landed up doing a manometry. And as you can see here, the upper third of the esophagus there is no contraction, but a normal contraction in the lower two-third. Myasthenia gravis, polymyositis, dermatomyositis, these are all proximal muscle weakness. They affect the upper third of the esophagus because the upper third of the esophagus is made out of skeletal muscle, while the lower two-third, which gets affected in scleroderma, is made out of smooth muscle. So that's why the manometry findings are different. Eosinophilic esophagitis, again, a common cause of dysphagia, more commonly reported in the West, but we are seeing them intermittently. Patients again present classically with dysphagia, heartburn, regurgitation, sometimes odynophagia, food impaction. They commonly may have associated asthma or atopic dermatitis or multiple food allergies. When you test, you find a high IgE, 30 or 40% may have peripheral eosinophilia, but it is the endoscopist who has to suspect it. So when an endoscopist is doing an endoscopy for dysphagia and does not find anything in the esophagus, sometimes it may even be normal, he must take mid-esophageal biopsies. Some patients of eosinophilic esophagitis will have linear furrows, circular rings, proximal strictures, white papules, and a small caliber esophagus. So this is the very classical picture. You can see here the white, small white kind of micro abscesses. These are the circular rings. These are the linear furrows. But these are not found in all patients. These are found in very few patients. So most patients will have a history of dysphagia, and the endoscopist should take a mid-esophageal biopsy if he does not find any cause to explain his dysphagia. The treatment again is, they are known to respond to twice daily proton pump inhibitor again. So I think it's the third time I'm mentioning in my talk, proton pump inhibitors in patients with dysphagia should be given minimum for 6 to 8 weeks, preferably 3 months. Many of these conditions respond. Eosinophilic esophagitis also responds to a 6-food elimination diet. So these patients may be allergic. They may not be allergic per se, but eliminating these foods from their diet helps with their dysphagia. So eliminate cow milk proteins, soya, wheat, egg, peanut, and seafood. Those patients who don't respond to proton pump inhibitors and the 6-food elimination diet can be given fluticasone spray, which they are told not to breathe in, but to swallow it, or they may be given budesonide, which is crushed and given in a slurry along with honey, or oral prednisolone may have to be given in these patients. Coming to the last point is functional dysphagia. So a person who has everything normal, does he have what we call as functional dysphagia? That he has a sense of solid or liquid food getting stuck in his esophagus, but there is no endoscopic esophageal mucosal or structural. Structural means you have done a biopsy for eosinophilic esophagitis and said there is no eosinophilic esophagitis. There is no reflux disease, and your manometry is normal, that there is no achalasia, no EJG obstruction, no distal spasm, no absent peristalsis, and no hypercontractile esophagus. If all of these criteria are fulfilled and the patient still has dysphagia, he is not a nutcase. Please don't send him directly to the psychiatrist. He's got functional dysphagia. These symptoms commonly occur intermittently and post meals. We tell them to avoid the trigger foods, reassure them that you have investigated, there is no cancer, he is not going to die. Drugs like calcium channel blockers have been found to have some benefit. Tricyclic antidepressants like amitriptyline have been shown to decrease visceral hypersensitivity and helps patients with functional dysphagia. And even some people who don't respond to anything respond to a single large Savary-Gillard dilator. A Savary-Gillard dilator is a bougie dilator. A single dilator of 17 or 18 may help. Please note that it is not without any risk. Worldwide, there have been an occasional case of esophageal perforation with a single large bougie dilatation has occurred. But if done in expert hands, it should not be a problem and has been tried in patients with functional dysphagia. So coming to my last slide, my conclusion, how do you approach a case of non-obstructive dysphagia? Non-obstructive dysphagia means your endoscopy does not show any obstruction. 4 steps. First, remember dysphagia is an alarm symptom. Do not ignore it. Do not give trial of therapy. Do not send them away. Investigate. Endoscopy is preferred over barium swallow because it has a higher pickup. Even if your barium is normal, you're going to do endoscopy. If your barium is abnormal, you're still going to do endoscopy. So why not do endoscopy first? So the algorithm has changed. Endoscopy first. You want to rule out any obstructive cause. you want to rule out reflux, you want to rule out eosinophilic esophagitis. Once you've ruled all these out and you still don't have a cause, then the test is esophageal manometry, where our main cause is achalasia or any of the spastic or hypercontractile, that is distal esophageal spasm or jackhammer esophagus, need to be excluded. And then depending on the cause that you find, you treat the specific cause. Thank you very much for your patient hearing. Yogesh, I think you're mute.
Dr. Senani, thank you for your talk, and it was very lucid presentation. I think the ideal presentation which would have been for physicians and surgeons and also general practitioners who have joined us. I would like to request our moderators and chairpersons to please give your comments. Dr. Sanghvi, you are a very senior surgeon and you might have encountered many patients with upper GI symptoms. So, please share your experience. How do you approach a patient of dysphagia in brief? When do you ask patient for manometry? Do all patients of patients who have non-obstructive dysphagia, you advise manometry or you do barium? And then you can ask few questions to our expert also. And there will be questions in chat box. Dr. Dhiren, you can please conduct those questions.
Sir, one question from Nandlal Sharma. It is true that the hiatus hernia lead to dysphagia in future?
No, I don't think hiatus hernia causes dysphagia. Unless you have a paraesophageal hernia, then that can cause dysphagia. Usually patients of hiatus hernia will have symptoms of reflux, heartburn, regurgitation. If left untreated, you can develop a stricture and cause dysphagia, but usually their symptoms are of volume reflux.
Sir, actually, many times we have encountered many patients who come to us with reflux as well as dysphagia. And we feel they might be having peptic stricture, but when we do an endoscopy, the scopy is normal. They have hiatus or maybe lax LES, but they have dysphagia. And when we give them PPIs for good amount of time, their dysphagia surprisingly disappears.
Yes. So that is because of the esophageal dysmotility. So these patients have reflux or acid coming up and hitting against their esophageal muscle, esophageal mucosa, which has the nerve centers. And this causes esophageal dysmotility. And like I said, in that one study I showed, almost 48% of patients, if positively asked about their symptoms, may, like, you know, they did a very simple thing. They kept like a questionnaire. Do you need water to drink? So they didn't ask, does food get stuck? They said, do you need water to drink? Can you eat dry foods fast? Like that. They asked, you know, to a common man questions like that. They had a questionnaire and they found that almost 48% of patients with long-standing reflux disease may have dysphagia. And of course, it responds to PPI.
Let me interrupt here. I have the same question as Dr. Yogesh Sarwani has asked. I have seen some patients have dysphagia. You do the endoscopy, you see the reflux esophagitis, no peptic stricture. You go for the CT and even esophageal manometry. So it is also normal. Some of the such patient improve with the high PPI dose, but some of them are still symptomatic. For those patients, should we offer any other medications or should we go for the dilatation?
No, dilatation. What are you dilating? But you have to understand that if they had reflux esophagitis, they definitely had reflux. There's no question about it, because you are saying you saw mucosal erosion, you saw mucosal abnormality. So definitely symptoms are related to reflux disease. And their dysphagia after PPI, if they still persist, you can trying anything else, calcium channel blockers and all is counteractive, because it will reduce the lower esophageal sphincter pressures more. So I think I would put them on amitriptyline and see whether it helps to reduce. Yes. I'll reach for them and I will use, especially because you're telling me esophageal motility is also normal.
Normal. Yes. Yes.
So usually those patients who have reflux disease and they complain of dysphagia, when we do an endoscope, when we do a manometry, they have ineffective esophageal peristalsis.
Yes.
And this
Most of the
infective
times, most of the
PPI,
time
yeah.
it is
Yes,
done.
yes. But sometimes,
But
yes, possible.
yeah, manometry is also normal.
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
If we see the patient of GERD, when they don't respond to the medical line of treatment, we subject them for some surgical intervention. So in many centers at the district level, manometry and pH study is not available. So in that case, how much is the importance of manometry and pH study before subjecting the patient for the laparoscopic fundoplication? Whether it is mandatory or you can, on an endoscopy finding, you can subject the patient for the surgery.
Sir, I'll tell you why it is mandatory and why it is a good idea. Because if you ask any surgeon, a laparoscopic fundoplication gone bad, that patient never leaves you. And if you ask surgeons, they are really harassed because they develop the bloat, the dysphagia.
Post-operative.
Yeah. So what manometry is doing is it's going to predict your chance of post-operative dysphagia.
Yes.
If you have normal manometry, in the sense esophageal motility before fundoplication, with good confidence, you can do a complete wrap.
Yes.
But if you have ineffective motility, you may want to do either a floppy or a 272 pair wrap. That's what most of the surgeons will do. I think that's important. See, in the Western world, all guidelines actually say that the decision for a fundoplication should be based on a pH. Most Indian centers are not following that because of cost and availability.
Yes, yes.
I think in a patient who has non-erosive reflux disease, so you have a patient who has heartburn, endoscopy is normal, there is no hiatus hernia. I think I want a pH. I want to prove definitely the reflux in him. But you tell me his endoscopy is showing a 5 centimeters hiatus hernia. He is having volume reflux. Okay, it is non-erosive, but he has a significant anatomical defect. And manometry is showing low LES pressures with, say, normal motility. I will, and if the surgeon says, should I operate? I'll say yes.
Yes.
He's a volume refluxer. He responds to PPI. He's got an anatomical defect. Why not? I think you have enough evidence to say that all this is happening because of reflux. So I think our aim is we should have sufficient evidence to say that there is reflux and the symptoms are due to reflux. If a patient has cough, laryngeal pharyngeal reflux, and patient says, doctor, aap karo laparoscopy, but my cough should go.
Yes.
I will never do without her pH and this, because if the pH does not show good symptom correlation, his cough is not going to go and he is not going to ever leave you. So I think we need to protect ourselves, to give enough evidence to the patient that there is, this is your condition, and that's when we want to do.
So you recommend prior to all fundoplication, irrespective of hiatus, good evidence of hiatus on endoscopy, we should go for manometry and pH metry, both.
Yes, manometry is for all. I don't think anybody should do laparoscopic fundoplication without a manometry. Yeah.
If there is a hypomotility of the esophagus, then that will be detected by manometry, and we can go for a partial wrap rather than complete 360 Nissen fundoplication.
Yes, sir. Also, now actually we are getting some new technical data. We don't know how much its role is there in actually in the surgical decision, but now we can tell the pressures of the crural diaphragm and in a hernia patient, crural diaphragm and LES, and look at where the inversion point is, and that may be able to tell the surgeon that there is no effect of the crural diaphragm and that you need to do an adequate crural repair along with, I know most of the surgeons anyway do a repair in a hiatus hernia, but getting that information upfront. So the evidence is still not strong, but now the manometry is giving us that crucial differentiation. And some surgeons, like who are actively doing fundoplication surgery, if I have not written it, they will call me and ask, how are his crural pressure? They want to know pre-op. Yes, they're going to open and see everything, but they want to know, they want a plan in their mind before the pre-op. what they want to do inside.
So in our practice, routinely we refer our patient, being a surgeon, to the gastroenterologist, and we always take their opinion whether this patient is having any other problem, or according to their advice, we go for laparoscopic fundoplication. Otherwise, we give conservative treatment.
Okay, sir. That's very good.
Sir, do you recommend manometry for all patients with non-obstructive dysphagia in today's era?
Yeah, so if the endoscopy picks up eosinophilic esophagitis or some erosive esophagitis which is causing the dysphagia, if you have a cause, then I don't think you need to do manometry. But if you don't have a cause, then I would like to find the cause before I treat.
I have another question. After POEM, if patient develops reflux, because some patient may develop reflux,
yes.
then how can we manage in a after POEM procedure?
Correct.
So some of them have changed the way they do POEM, but a lot of people who are doing the classical POEM. Yeah, Yogesh.
Yeah, please. Go ahead, sir.
Go ahead, Yogesh. Tell them about POEM. I don't do POEM myself, so you are probably...
Basically, sir, now studies, they don't show much reflux now.
Okay.
Earlier studies used to show, but now they don't show. I have personally done around 17 to 18 POEMs till now, and hardly anybody has come to me with reflux. And I had spoken to many other gastro and surgeons who are doing POEM. They are also not encountering much reflux.
Is it because of the posterior approach?
Yes, sir. And in case if we get a reflux after POEM, now we have available GERD-X system. GERD-X system, which helps to tighten the lower esophageal sphincter, and it helps to prevent reflux. That also can be done endoscopically. Now recently there is an endoscopic approach by which you can do POEM as well as endoscopic fundoplication also. But that technique is not much well versed, and GERD-X is better than endoscopic fundoplication. So in case if you have GERD-X, we can go for endoscopic fundo. In case if you have reflux after POEM, we can go for endoscopic fundoplication.
I have one more question to ask. Senani sir, as we are practicing in the periphery area.
Ekant, you're silent. Yeah.
You are mute.
Mute.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah. So when you are practicing in periphery, there are so many patients with achalasia cardia. They are not ready for any surgical or endoscopic intervention. So in such patient, do you have any experience with the calcium channel blockers, particularly nifedipine?
No, you should just say, I'm sorry, I cannot treat. You have to tell them. I think you have to put your foot down. I think patients are just bullying the doctors for no reason. This is what you have to treat. I cannot treat. You can go elsewhere. They can go and try whatever other pathies they want to try, or any other way that they feel. I think we have to be honest and stick to what we can do best. And yes, I understand financial issues are there in smaller towns. People may not be able to travel to a bigger center, or availability of facilities. But
your experience with the nifedipine?
Very poor, less than 5%.
Okay.
I never even put it. I don't. So every patient says, no, till we do the manometry, till we do the CT scan, give us some treatment. I say no. Because you give them a false sense of security, because when they go home, they all say, oh, let us take this for 2 months. Then they will not be better. Then they will go to Yogesh and say, Arey, that Ekant is not a good doctor. He gave me tablets, nothing happened. You do something like that. So it's not worth it. So only like an elderly person who is high risk, you can't do anything. Even for them, I feel it just doesn't help. It hardly helps. So I avoid.
So there are many questions by Dr. Smith Kumar Vagasha. He is a very active candidate. He has attended almost all sessions. So Dr. Dhiren Bhai, can you please read out a few questions by Dr. Smith?
I can read out.
One question from Smith Kumar Vagasha is eosinophilic esophagitis prevalence management algorithm by you with follow-up.
Yeah, it's exactly like the slide which I said. You first give them a proton pump inhibitor, then you do the 6 food elimination diet. If that does not work, then you have an option of oral fluticasone, budesonide oral, or oral prednisolone.
Yes, sir. And another question is as difference between GERD and functional dysphagia. What is the difference between?
Yeah, so in GERD, the cause of dysphagia, as Yogesh was saying, is it is because of reflux disease. So reflux disease is causing decreased motility of the food pipe, which is causing the food to get stuck.
So actually, he has asked a difference between non-erosive reflux disease.
Non-erosive. Sorry, okay. Non-erosive reflux disease. Yeah. So in non-erosive reflux disease, there are no erosions. Means there is no ulcers. That doesn't mean that there is no reflux. There are certain changes on narrowband imaging which can pick up reflux. You can do biopsy of the lower end of the esophagus, which can tell you reflux. You can do a 24-hour pH study, which can tell you reflux. And most importantly, patients of non-erosive reflux disease, which are almost 30% of the population of reflux patients, they will respond to proton pump inhibitors. While the functional dysphagias will not, because they don't have reflux disease. So they have no reflux in patients of functional dysphagia.
One question is sketching ring and esophageal web difference between them and management.
So esophageal webs we commonly see at the upper end of the esophagus, just below the cricopharynx. Schartzi's rings are more at the lower end, just above the lower esophageal sphincter. Both need dilatation. Now, whether sometimes the upper web, just by passage of your scope, it breaks. Sometimes you need to put what is called a bougie or a Sabry-Gillard. Some people even use a CRE balloon. Same way the Schartzi's ring. It either sometimes breaks with the passage of the scope or you need to put a dilator.
There is a question by senior physician Dr. Mustafa Rangwala that patients suffering from oropharyngeal dysphagia, what is your PPI of choice?
So oropharyngeal dysphagia, sir, PPIs will not work. Oropharyngeal dysphagias are rarely due to reflux, because oropharyngeal dysphagias are because they have a difficulty in initiating, they are not able to masticate, or they are not, it's called transfer dysphagia, or they are not able to transfer food bolus from the oral cavity into the esophagus. So I would go after a neurological cause or a myopathic cause or a local lesion or a nerve issue which is causing oropharyngeal dysphagia.
So there is one very simple but practical question. What is the difference on endoscopy between lax LES and hiatus hernia? How do you differentiate them? When do you classify, when do you write lax LES or you report it as hiatus hernia?
I think, Yogesh, you are the expert here, don't you think?
No. Question is for you.
No, so it's, I think a lax LES is that when the endoscopist is going in, the lower esophageal sphincter is open, or when he does what is called a J maneuver in the stomach, that is, he looks up from the body of the stomach, he's trying to look up back at the G junction and he sees that the lower esophageal sphincter is open. Well, you can say that, oh, the LES relaxed when you reach there, and that's why it may falsely tell you that it's a lax LES. But in hiatus hernia, there's a definite difference in the sense that what we call the Z line and the crural impression on the esophagus. So normally the Z line and the compression of the crura on the G junction overlap. If this separates, that means the Z line comes up, and that means part of the stomach is now herniating into the chest. That's when you will see this when you tell the patient to, either when the patient deeply inspires, you will see the crura of the crura pressing against the esophagus, and you can see this gap between the two, and that's hiatus hernia.
I have
even for this hiatus hernia during the J maneuver, you have inverted bowel appearance.
Yes.
That is one of the classic appearance.
Yes, even on J maneuver.
Yeah.
I have one question. This proton pump inhibitor is used for months and years. So is there any side effect or?
So now there are side effects being noted when patients are taking it for long, like 10 years and longer. I think the important thing is don't give it if you don't need it. 90% of the patients are taking it over the counter. So I think that's where the problem is. And then this thing I say is that a physician, he's seeing his family doctor, he's seeing orthopedic surgeon, he's seeing cardiologist. So one patient is seeing 4 different doctors. Cardiologist is giving pantoprazole with Ecosprin. Because for every patient he goes, he's going for his heart, but he will complain about his dyspepsia. When he comes to the gastroenterologist, he's complaining about that. He's going. So I had one patient who was actually taking 140 milligrams of PPI and 120 milligrams of domperidone. Because he was not telling one doctor what the other one was giving, and he was getting multiple PPI and domperidone from everybody. So I think that we should not misuse. Don't give it. And I usually tell patients, take it for 2 months, stop it for 15 days, then come and see me. So you try to give breaks. You tell them after 3 months, 6 months, try to give a break and try to come to minimum effective dose. See, nobody wants to change their lifestyle. The fat person doesn't want to become thin. He wants to eat his dinner. No, my work is there. My shop closes at 10. I have to eat dinner at 10. That is your problem. You have to do something. You are not well. Your health is not good. You have to eat your dinner early. There's no option for it. Your proton pump inhibitor is not going to prevent it. So lifestyle, nobody is willing to do. Nobody is willing to lose their weight. Nobody is willing to not eat junk food. And that's where you have to push them for it.
Yes, you are absolutely right, because so many times we see multiple prescription. Some prescription from cardiology, some for analgesic with proton pump inhibitor. And if we don't go through all the prescription, patient may be taking more than 40, 80 milligram of proton pump inhibitors.
So there is one question by Dr. Amit Kumar Thakur. What is the dose of amitriptyline which you use?
So I usually start with 10 milligrams and then increase to 25. Especially if they have insomnia, then you are easier to give higher. But a lot of people, say that they feel drowsy next day also. So many times I like to give it a little earlier. Means I tell them don't take it at 10 o'clock, take it at 8 o'clock, so that you have 1 or 2 hours on this side of the day. And so if the patient has some insomnia, then it helps. But most people, I think 10 milligrams does the trick.
Other questions?
Last question, sir, if you allow us, sir.
Yes, yes.
What is the difference between, no doubt it is not related to our today's non-obstructive, it is obstructive dysphagia. But what is the difference between Satsky's ring, esophageal web, and how to manage either of them?
I mentioned that one. I mentioned the 2 treatment earlier. That web is at the upper end, Satsky's ring is at the lower end. Both need dilatation.
So if there are no further questions, I think Dr. Sanghvi, you can give a vote of thanks, sir.
Yes. Good evening, friends. First of all, I congratulate Dr. Yogesh and Ahmedabad Physician Association for organizing such a wonderful advanced gastroenterology summit. It is really very useful to all the delegates, to the surgeons, to the physicians. Today, I also congratulate Dr. Rajesh Sainani for sparing time and giving a very lucid and comprehensive talk on non-obstructive dysphagia. He has covered entire the subject, management, its cause, imaging, as well as manometry. So this is definitely very beneficial to all of us. I am also thankful to the moderator, Dr. Ekant, and I am also thankful to Dr. Chairperson, Dr. Dhirendra. Here also I am thankful to all the participants for their sparing time, all the delegates, and joining with us. Good night to everyone. Thank you.
There were 209 participants, sir.
Yes, sir.
It was
Very
really nice, and I hope everybody has enjoyed today's presentation.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.